It's hard to make people sane. That's the lesson we learned at Glore Psychiatric Museum, where exhibits show how those who've been judged mentally ill have been burned, shocked, shackled, kicked, dunked, punched, and killed in an effort to make them well.
Shoot. Oh my gosh, is this the real? What if they did a Halloween tour and we can go down here? This person pops up.
Crap.
Two people choked to death from peach pits. Other
And
patients
when?
died from head injuries slipping on ice in 1959. One strangled herself when she fell out of bed.
So a lot of accidental deaths.
Wow, is that like after the autopsy or something?
Yeah, the evidence, I guess.
Sheesh.
A doctor in the museum's introductory video explains that early physicians did their best with what they knew, but thousands of artifacts suggest that America's asylums were once filled with dangerous lunatics, and they weren't all inmates. Identified as one of the 50 most unusual museums in America, Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri, is a macabre collection of unsettling displays documenting the treatment of the mentally ill over the centuries. From a 19th century dowsing tank to an exhibit of more than 1,000 metal objects removed from a patient's stomach, you will no doubt come away with this interesting museum highly enlightened and very glad you're not crazy, assuming that you're not. The museum is housed in a building of the former St. Joseph's State Mental Hospital and is named for George Glore, who worked there as an occupational therapist. In 1968, he asked his patients to build full-size replicas of early treatment devices such as the human hamster wheel and the lunatic box, and management was so impressed that it asked Glore to create a museum. Over the decades, it has grown to fill 4 floors, the largest exposition of psychiatric treatment history in the USA. The story begins in 1872 when Missouri State Legislature approved $200,000 for the building of a lunatic asylum, and St. Joseph citizens convinced the legislature to locate it east of their city. Opening its doors on November 9, 1874, the hospital was called the State Hospital for the Insane No. 2, or more familiarly named the Lunatic Asylum No. 2. Beginning with 25 patients, the first hospital superintendent described the institution as the noble work of reviving hope in the human heart and dispelling purportentous clouds that penetrate the intellects of the minds diseased. And so it was for the next 127 years. In no time at all the hospital's 275 beds filled when relatives no longer can handle the special needs of family members with mental illness. Soon, an additional 120 beds were added, then another 250, then more and more over the years, as the hopelessly mentally ill poured through their doors. In the hospital's early years, the asylum was a self-sufficient institution where patients worked on a farm, raising crops and livestock to provide food for the facility. Allegedly, the hospital needed only to purchase salt and sugar to supplement their food provisions. The hospital continued to be referred to as the State Lunatic Asylum No. 2 until 1899, when it gained the name the St. Joseph State Hospital. By the early 1950s, the facility had grown to nearly 3,000 beds and housed some of the most criminally insane individuals in the state, as well as those that could be rehabilitated and others who were merely depressed. According to the museum, a few of these patients were just mildly depressed individuals who were dumped there by annoyed relatives. With modern medications, more and more patients began to return to society. Throughout its history, the hospital underwent a series of experimental treatments for its patients, some of which sound more like a cause rather than a cure for insanity.
We wanted everyone to understand it wasn't just us doing horrific things,
said Kathy Reno, the museum spokeswoman.
Everyone was doing horrific things.
The museum's exhibit spanned the history of mental illness therapy, from witch burnings and devil stompings to the only slightly less gruesome treatments that followed. The bath of surprise, for example, sometimes drowned patients. The tranquilizer chair kept its victims immobile for the application of leeches. The human hamster wheel looks fun. Kathy said that visitors often asked to try it, but patients were usually locked inside and forced to run for up to 2 straight days. 20th century exhibits include items used at the St. Joseph Hospital during Glore's own lifetime: restraining belts, early tranquilizers, clubs, electroshock superchargers, enema tubes, and doctor-designed ice picks for lobotomies. Kathy said that visitors will tell her,
I'm glad I wasn't considered crazy back then.
and then she'll have to explain that the definition of crazy was considerably broader in those days.
They'll say, you mean you could really be admitted for anything? And I'll say, yep. You could be checked in by a family member for whatever. We have the records. The bad news about mental illness,
said Kathy, quoting George Glore,
is that everybody's got a little something.
Glore retired from government service in the 1990s. By the early 1990s, the majority of the patients of the asylum had been released back into society with the help of modern medications. In August 1994, the state of Missouri approved a bond that allowed for the large asylum campus and hospital to be converted into a correctional facility. By July 1997, a new state-of-the-art building was completed across the street from the original campus, and the new Northwest Missouri Psychiatric Rehabilitation opened with 108 beds. It was also in 1997 that Glore Psychiatric Museum was forced to move from the campus and soon relocated to a 1968 building that once served as a clinic for patients at the mental hospital, which now sits right outside the prison fence. The Western Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center opened the old asylum campus in 1999, now confining over 1,800 inmates. Some had more than others, and Glore had an eye for preserving the hospital's most memorable manifestations of odd behavior. Its ceiling-high cage is filled with 108,000 cigarette packs saved by a patient who thought they'd be redeemed for a wheelchair. The Schizophrenia through Embroidery Exhibit showcases the needlework of a woman who wouldn't speak for over 30 years, but communicated through words she stitched into fabric. The television diary, discovered in 1971, was a hospital ward TV stuffed with over 500 secret notes, written by a patient who may have believed that the information would be transmitted through the television. The oldest display of the museum dates to 1910, an imaginative starburst arrangement, 1,446 buttons, screws, bolts, and nails that were eaten by a patient who died unexpectedly. They were only discovered during her autopsy. Management continues to collect artifacts and to add exhibits to the museum. In a gallery displaying patient art, for example, there's a self-portrait ceramic head of a fanged man who believed he was evil. A mosaic made of tens of thousands of tiny egg shell fragments, and a frightening replica of the dagger-toothed knife-wielding devil doll from the 1970s TV movie Trilogy of Terror. There was even a contribution from George Glore himself, a miniature diorama of one of the hospital wards featuring Barbie in a straitjacket. More exhibits display mannequins that show examples of the unspeakable treatment received by the mentally ill. Back in the old days, fever cabinets were used in the treatment of syphilis. Lined with rows of high-wattage light bulbs, the treatment was utilized to elevate the patient's body temperature, intending to kill the virus and cure the syphilis. Visitors want to know more about the unnamed patients behind these exhibits, but they are disappointed to learn that medical privacy rules will forever keep them anonymous.
They want to know these people's names, where they come from, why did they do these things?
Kathy said.
If we had the answer to that last question, they wouldn't have been here.